Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we'll be talking about Chapter 6, Part 2. Let's talk about building ethics safeguard into the company. So, how can you prevent these ethical decisions from going wrong? Here we talk about improving the quality of a company's ethical performance. You have to change the culture so that ethics is part of everyday decision making. And to do so means institutionalizing ethics and building ethical safeguards into everyday routines. This should really sound familiar, again, from when we spoke to Alexi at Citibank. He said that this ethical decision making happens every day and that employees should be taught because, right, ethics is a learned skill. Clear ethical and correct ethical decision making is a learned skill that should be taught and enforced on a daily basis. When we talk about the percentage of firms reporting that they have ethical safeguards, you can see that there are a handful of different areas where they talk about this. So, and a couple of different sources where we've gotten this information. When we talk about organizations have developed a code of ethics, you'll see that most sources here, the Center for Business Ethics in 86 and 92, and then these ethics resource centers up until 2013. For the most part, almost 100% of firms say that they've developed a code of ethics. But when we talk about offering ethics trainings, you'll see that some sources say that they do, but some sources say that they don't. And the nice thing is that as we move forward into 2013, this source, Weber and Wasilewski, they said that actually almost 100% of companies have offered ethics trainings. I've worked for probably 9 or 10 different companies, and I'd say 7 or 8 of them have offered ethics trainings for the most part, and becomes more and more popular with time. So I can believe this data that probably almost 100%. When we talk about creating ethics officers or an ethics office, as you can see that there's less and less. And then when we establish ethics hotline, in 2013, they're saying that this is a possibility, but those other sources have disappeared and they haven't reported on this. Personally, I think I've only worked for one organization that has an ethics hotline, and it would be like a very large organization. It was Citibank, and it wasn't really talked about or used very frequently, in my opinion. Let's talk about two different ethics approaches when it comes to this chapter, or when it comes to organizations. We're going to talk about compliance-based and integrity-based approach. So the first one, a compliance-based approach, this seeks to avoid legal sanctions, and it emphasizes the threat of detection and punishment. This is all about an increased employee willingness to seek ethical advice. So the employee actually has to go forward and actually seek the advice that they need to make an ethical decision or to report an ethical issue that they see coming up. When we talk about an integrity-based approach, this is different. This combines concern for law with the employee's responsibility. This promotes acting with integrity and conducts business with honesty and fairness. So this is more about an increased commitment to the organization and a willingness to deliver bad news to your supervisor. So they say here, both approaches have been found to lessen unethical conduct, but in somewhat different ways, right? So the compliance-based approach is more about the organization, and the integrity-based approach is more about the individual having the power or the integrity within themselves to make these decisions. When we talk about ethics programs and policies, this is all about, right, ethics starts at the top, as Alexi said. So this is really having top management commitment and involvement. And as he said, it's really critical to fostering employee ethical behavior. There are a handful here of ethics policies or codes that we're going to talk about. These are as a guidance or key parts to these policies and codes. So these are as a guidance to managers' employees to solve ethical dilemmas. In the U.S., policies tend to be instrumental, including providing rules and procedures that will as opposed to other places where they might just be within the culture and they won't necessarily be easily identified. That's slowly moving throughout the world, but here in the U.S., we are a little bit ahead of the game in theory when it comes to implementing ethical codes. We actually do mostly have true instruments that help us measure these ideas. An example is that in Japan, policies tend to be a combination of legal compliance and company values. So again, Japan talks, their culture is they're really ingrained often in their culture, and so they put these values within the organization, and those are easily recognizable within the company values. Ethical programs, they must be widely distributed and associated with an ethics training. The example that they give here is that 3M, they have their code of conduct in our textbook, and those are to be good, be honest, be fair, be loyal, be accurate, and be respectful. So that is a really good example of how an American company clearly identifies their ethical values. Let's move on to the next slide. This is another slide on ethics programs and policies. We're going to talk about here ethics and compliance officers. So what are these groups and what do these people do? As they say here, the many were created as early as the 1980s. Personally, I didn't see this showing up until the early 2000s. There's a membership in professional associations. So if you are an ethics compliance officer, then you probably have a membership in this Ethics and Compliance Officers Association, ECOA. And that membership doubled, as I said in the early 2000s, it became much more popular. So it doubled between 2000 and 2004. And recently, the ECOA and the Ethics Resource Center merged into the Ethics Compliance Alliance. And this is all a result, this uptick of interest in ethics all happened because of Sarbanes-Oxley. If you ever work in the finance industry, you'll hear about this again and again. SOX is the short term, the cool name for Sarbanes-Oxley. And this happened because of the Enron scandal. So they put in a lot of government regulation as to how we look at ethics within the workplace because of the SOX regulations. And so when we talk about reporting when it comes to ethics, there's some handful of mechanisms that we use here. So they like to use the helpline or a hotline very often for people to report ethical issues. The purposes here are to provide interpretations of proper ethical behavior, to create an avenue for reporting unethical conduct, and to provide information sharing tools for employees and stakeholders. The interesting thing that I thought was cool, but maybe not cool, about the hotline is that executives actually tend to use the helpline more often than middle managers, because I guess because maybe as an executive, this is my own idea, is that you see these ethical decisions coming up time and time again, and those decisions fall in your lap, as opposed to lower and middle managers. Those decisions are often made by higher level. But at the same time, the author of this textbook and a lot of critics of these hotlines are saying that there's a vulnerability that these middle-level managers are actually still making ethical decisions, and they're not turning to the hotline to ask for advice or to potentially report something that they think has gone wrong. So we need to move forward in society, in the U.S. society, and giving middle managers more encouragement to use that hotline if they see it's appropriate. The U.S., on the other hand, is doing really well when it comes to these hotlines and these ethical decisions. So U.S. firms use these hotlines much more than abroad. And as I said, Alexei mentioned a lot of these things in his presentation. Another thing that came up in the readings here is that in 2014, 87% of firms made some effort to provide a secure and anonymous reporting channel. So as we saw in that graph a couple of slides ago, that very quickly is this hotline becoming more and more of a popular mechanism. And I'm on page 125 to 126 of your textbook if you're following along. Let's hop into the last couple of slides of this chapter. Two more slides on ethic programs and policy. Let's talk about actual programs. So these are generally the most expensive and time-consuming element of an ethics program. If you've ever taken an ethical training, you'll see that there's a lot of time and energy and money spent into creating these programs and then rolling them out. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably millions of dollars go into creating an ethical program for one particular organization. These are found regularly in larger business organizations. Small and medium businesses are more likely to offer training in alignment with regulatory guidelines. So the example that they give here is Giving Voice to Values program. So this is the question that they ask here in this program is, what if I were going to act on my particular values at work? So we want to, it's a program to, we want to act on these values, but we want to feel that we have a chance of doing that effectively. So the trend now is that people have more and more confidence in their own values, but they need the confidence to be able to speak up against those values or speak up for those values and feel that they're going to be heard. That in the past, there was kind of this, like, I don't want to say pushing down, but almost like when you had a voice about these values, there wasn't an audience to hear these opinions. And now as we move forward in American society, we're more and more aware of these items, and that this Giving Voice to Values program is a great example of an ethical program where it encourages employees to speak up at the end of the day and speak up against their own values. That's why here at LMU, we spend so much time helping you identify your particular values so that when you go into the workplace, you understand how ethics works, and also if you feel that there's something that is against your ethical value, that you feel confident speaking up against it. Let's talk about these ethics programs and policies. These are the objectives and motivations for employee ethics training programs. So why would an organization want to create an ethical training program? The first and foremost is that they need to comply with laws and regulations, right? That is why Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank and all of these different bills and acts are so valuable, because they really encourage these organizations to comply. And I can speak for that as when I was at Citibank in 2003. Before 2003, we didn't really care about all these guidelines, but when Sarbanes-Oxley was voted in, then all of a sudden our business changed, and we had compliance officers, we had frameworks and spreadsheets and goals that we needed to meet. And so without those incentives, we probably would have never implemented these ideas. The second one here is to create a culture of ethics and respect, obviously, and I won't go through all these, but you get the idea that these are different reasons why why companies would have an ethics training program. The bottom one is to establish strong legal defenses. Oops. So, yeah, that is a good reason, so that if you get into trouble, you have backup that you actually did create an ethical issue. Hopefully, most organizations never have to get there. Let's talk about this last slide. That was the last slide of ethics programs and policies. Now let's talk about who are the most ethical companies in the world. This is from Forbes magazine, and they listed here from 2007 to 2017 who were the most ethical companies. A lot of these companies are not necessarily familiar, maybe General Electric, International Paper, who creates a lot of the paper that we use in the classroom. But one company here that I think is very familiar to you all is Starbucks. And you probably have already heard of the ethical work that Starbucks does, right? They've, over the last couple of decades really made sure that their coffee beans come from an ethical source, right? That there's no child labor involved, that the farmers who are growing that work under good, healthy conditions, that a lot of their beans are organic, etc., that they help and don't hurt the environment. So as you can see, Starbucks shows up on this list for sure, because they really try and go above and beyond when it comes to ethics. And the interesting part that I'm surprised is not on this slide, that the textbook mentions that very often the most ethical companies actually outperform the S&P 500 and the FTSE 1000 every year. So that really goes to show that if companies are doing things ethically, then the employees are happy to work there and they're productive and they are contributing towards the bottom line, and the whole company is functioning on a higher level, and they are actually creating, a really nice bottom line at the end of the day. Let's talk about ethics in a global economy. This one came up for me a lot when I was in business school because I had a lot of colleagues after business school go to work in Africa. And this shows up time and time again, bribery, right? So doing business in a global context brings up a host of complex ethical challenges, and bribery is one of the top ones. So bribery, just to clarify, is a questionable or unjust payment, often to a government official to ensure or facilitate a business transaction, right? Paying off someone. There is an international watchdog agency called Transparency International that publishes a survey of countries' level of corruption. And they say that bribe taking more likely occurs in countries with low per capita income, low salaries for government officials, and less income variation. So, as you read in the book, right, the most popular countries where bribery happens are Syria, South Sudan, and Somalia. So all developing countries. But one of the countries that has the least likely opportunity for bribery is Switzerland, right? So countries that have a high GDP, that are functioning on a very efficient level, they don't have any place for bribery. The U.S. is actually 16th on the list, right? I thought that was pretty close to number one, considering that we think of ourselves as a quite developed nation, but still bribery happens in this country. If you go to work in any developing country, there will most likely be opportunities for bribery, and it's up to you to make that decision if that is the right decision for you or not. On our last slide here, we talk about some efforts to curtail these unethical practices. So there is a Dow Jones anti-corruption survey where 71% of the respondents stopped or delayed business dealings with corrupt partners. So this is an opportunity here for us to better know what organizations are engaging in bribery. One of the examples that they showed in the book, which I thought was super interesting, was Samsung in South Korea, that there was a huge bribery scandal here between the vice chairman of Samsung and the president of South Korea. They were caught in a bribery scandal, and the president was kicked out of office and sent to jail, as was the vice chairman of Samsung. So, right, that even South Korea is no longer a truly developing nation any longer. They've accelerated in the past couple of decades amazingly well, but still they have issues of corruption that go on in their country that they're very quickly trying to get rid of. And so there are numerous efforts to prohibit bribery. There's the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, as well as the United Kingdom's Bribery Act that prohibits bribery, and there are also big laws in Brazil, India, and Mexico, because those countries are really trying to encourage direct foreign investment to help their GDP. And so when they close down on these bribery opportunities, then it encourages organizations like Intel or Starbucks or IBM, etc., to invest in those countries because they have confidence that it won't have to be making these ethical decisions. And the last point here is that an organization's culture and ethical work climate plays a central role in encouraging employees to act ethically. And so I just want to bring home the fact that culture of an organization has a huge, strong influence on how people make decisions at all levels of the organization. And so if you, as a manager in an organization, you want to make sure that you're instilling a culture that is moving forward in an ethical way. Great, this was the end of Chapter 6. I'm Professor Green, and I look forward to seeing you in class.